Good afternoon, Dr. Santarita and everyone. I'm Christine Torres, Master of Asian Studies student, major in Southeast Asia. So this day I'll be presenting about the role of ASEAN's actors in combating online sexual exploitation of children in Southeast Asia, the case of the Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand. So this is a proposed study and this topic was actually narrowed down by focusing on a single form of a transnational crime that is emerging in specific countries in Southeast Asia, where Philippines is labeled as a global hotspot based on the existing literature. So a big chunk of my presentation would provide context of OSEC in specific ASEAN member states and the current interventions of ASEAN as a regional body. So this would be the outline of my presentation. First, I'll provide my research questions and objectives, and then second would be the review of related literature, third, the gaps in the literature, and fourth would be the synthesis and recommendations. So first, for my research questions, I would ask what are the forms of and contexts of OSEC in Southeast Asia, particularly in the three countries, the Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand. So later in my presentation, we will see that this crime has similarities and differences in context in these three countries. For instance, in the Philippines, the most prevalent form is live streaming. Second, what is the role of ASEAN in combating OSEC as a transnational crime in the region? So this is to explore on how ASEAN as a regional body views its position in terms of addressing OSEC as a transnational crimes that knows no digital borders. So third, who are the state and non-state actors involved in combating OSEC in Southeast Asia? So both state and non-state actors have crucial roles to play in this fight, and ultimately, we need all hands-on tech approach to this as it involves various sectors of the societies in Southeast Asia and globally. So therefore, this will be explored and identified in the proposed study. As for the objectives, I also have three. So first is to explore the context and forms of OSEC as a known phenomenon in the region, particularly in the countries where this transnational crime is prevalent. Second, to address the dirt in literature about OSEC as a transnational crime in the region and to contribute to a study which is relevant to ASEAN and countries where the crime is prevalent. And third, understand the role of ASEAN as a regional body and the state and non-state actors in combating OSEC in the region. For the review of related literature, first I'll talk about the context and then I'll discuss the regional interventions and the important roles of the actors in this fight against OSEC. And then I will also provide and point out the gaps in the existing literature. And then I will give a short synthesis and some recommendations based on the existing literature. So first, for the context. So there are actually various traditional and non-traditional security threats faced by the Southeast Asia region, and there are different facets of these threats, and most of them target the vulnerable populations, such as the children. So in this study, the focus is on the threat of the transnational crime in the region, particularly one that is hidden and happening in the digital arena, the online sexual exploitation of children, or OSEC hereafter. So actually, it is not a new phenomenon in the region. And then some countries in the region have already been identified as where the crime proliferates. For example, in the Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia, and even in Laos. So this is due to several reasons, but primarily because of poverty and lenient legislation. So based on the historical data and reports, our region, Southeast Asia, has actually been a destination for foreign and domestic offenders to sexually abuse or exploit children in person. But due to COVID-19 restrictions or lockdown, the demand for this abuse and the child sexual abuse materials and activities related to OSEC have increased. And then actually there are also evidences in the literature that proving that this threat is a pressing national, regional, and global concern. Aside to that, access and use of internet and communications technologies have also contributed to the proliferation of OSEC in the countries, especially in Southeast Asia. So, for example, Philippines was identified as a hotspot of OSEC according to various law enforcement agencies, and then Cambodia and Thailand have been previously identified as major suppliers of explicit or pornographic materials. However, there is paucity of literature providing timely data and comprehensive aspects of this crime in these three countries of concern in this study. So I chose these three countries because according to the existing literature, these are where OSEC is mostly manifested in the region compared to other neighboring countries. But still, we need more further research to measure the prevalence, drivers, and current interventions. So OSEC is actually manifested in different forms, varying among specific countries. So the first case is the Philippines, which is considered as a global hotspot of OSEC in Southeast Asia. So 2020, a global anti-slavery organization called International Justice Mission, or IJM, released a groundbreaking study titled Online Sexual Exploitation of Children in the Philippines, Analysis Recommendations for Governments, Industry, and Civil Society. So the study found that within 3 years, the estimated prevalence of child sexual exploitation happening on the internet had increased to more than 3 times. So in the Philippines, the major format of the abuse of OSEC is through live streaming or trafficking of child sexual exploitation materials, or TCSM. So another significant um, factor and feature of that is that it is a family-based crime where traffickers of children are usually parents or other members of the family. Especially Philippines is one of the poor countries in the region, so it is not surprising that financial motivation triggers most of the perpetrators committing the crime. So interestingly, the study also found that the crime OSEC is usually occurring on the surface of the internet through social media platforms and in other various open internet websites. And then another thing is that offenders are usually older men from Western countries who would negotiate producing or trafficking of child sexual exploitation materials. So this just shows that OSEC is indeed a transnational crime beyond border. And it is actually evolving and posing transnational threats to vulnerable target population, which is the children and their future. So because some customers have actually traveled already to the Philippines or at some point resided here to just abuse children. And then also other drivers or factors involved in proliferation of this crime are English proficiency, because we know that in the Philippines, anyone can speak English and the language is very familiar to all kinds of people and even regardless of socio-economic status. And then the robust financial institutions, especially the money transfer system, cheap devices and internet, and of course, as mentioned earlier, poverty. Also, this culture of no touch, no harm, or the misconception, if I may say, is another thing that affects the interventions and another thing that proliferates OSEC in the country. And then the culture of silence, or in communities where people believe that they should not meddle with the issues of one's family, that it is therefore better to keep peace and be silent. And then the surge of cases also during the pandemic has been reported. For instance, as reported by the Senate of the Philippines in 2021, the companies have reported that more than 1.29 million images and videos of child pornography came from the Philippines in 2020, which was more than triple the number in 2019 before the pandemic hit. Next is Thailand. So in Thailand, it is also obvious that OSEC manifests through production of CSAM for child pornography. However, it is challenging to find timely and accurate statistics for the actual number of children being exploited. And then usually this crime is associated with the child sexual exploitation in the travel and tourism industry. And similar with the Philippines, offenders are foreigners who would visit the country or demand CSAM through traffickers or through the internet. And then Thailand has also reported high risk of OSEC among children during the COVID-19 pandemic, and there are also surge of cases during the pandemic. So a country report says that, for example, in the span of 56 days, they arrested 44 offenders, and there were 9 search operations in 24 provinces. So these were based on the 53 cases involving OSEC. So for our next case is Cambodia. So similar to Thailand, OSEC in Cambodia is usually linked to child sexual exploitation in the travel and tourism industries through accessing, producing, and distributing sesame, grooming of potential child victims online with the intention of sexual exploitation, and live streaming of child sexual exploitation and abuse. So that's according to their royal government in 2017. So usually the arrested and convicted offenders are also foreigners. And then um, another important thing in Cambodia is that they view men as invulnerable and do not require protection or support. Therefore, the data and even the interventions for male child victims are lacking, and then usually it is more focused on the female child victims. And similarly, more OSEC cases during the COVID-19 pandemic were reported. So according to a non-government organization, APLE, in Cambodia. So there are more OSEC cases in Cambodia in 2021 during the pandemic, but the efforts are still minimal and there's still need for stronger legislation. Next part of my presentation would be the regional interventions, specifically the ASEAN in combating OSEC. So I have listed here three particular important points as for the regional interventions. First, the ASEAN expression of its regional commitment to fight OSEC through the Regional Plan of Action on Elimination of Violence Against Children, or the ASEAN RPA on EVAC, acknowledging that it is a fundamental responsibility of the state parties to prevent and respond to violence against children. Then part of the specific measures that ASEAN member states committed to do under this regional action plan were amending and ensuring effective implementation of laws that would protect children and eliminate OSEC, multidisciplinary approach to promote their rights, strengthening existing national mechanisms, strengthening the capacity of law enforcement agencies and other stakeholders involved, encouraging research and data collection, strengthening social welfare services, and strengthening ASEAN dialogue partners with UN agencies, civil society, community-based organizations, academia, philanthropists, and private entities. So, ASEAN sees violence as priority and a multicultural concern under its development agenda. However, stakeholders in the region acknowledge that the crime continues to spread in the region and still find it hard to combat. So in 2019 also, ASEAN released its Declaration on the Protection of Children from All Forms of Online Exploitation and Abuse in ASEAN. The declaration stated ASEAN's concern over the ongoing and emerging global threats that are making more children vulnerable to the borderless nature of the production and sharing of CSAM and other forms of online child exploitation, which require increasing awareness of right holders and duty bearers, strengthening child protection systems. So therefore, ASEAN expresses further commitment to protect children from this violence and abuse through implementation of its priority measures specified in the declaration. Lastly, the first ASEAN Regional Conference on Child Online Protection, which was held in Bangkok, Thailand in February 2020, as reported by the UNICEF. So it involved government representatives, United Nations, NGOs, young people, and partners who came together to explore ways to protect children online. So in terms of responses and efforts, UNICEF says that most ASEAN member states have law enforcement units that are dedicated to handling and responding crimes against children, including OSEC. The governments have developed report hotlines also, especially for child exploitation, with the support of different NGOs. In addition, there are also medical services, psychosocial support, and residential rehabilitation systems for the victims. Nonetheless, ECPAT believes that the responsive support services in Southeast Asia are still scarce. There is also a need to have services that are applicable to all victims, regardless of sex and age, for them to fully recover in a protected environment. So, for instance, female survivors usually have more access to services of recovery and integration compared to male survivors. And there are also NGOs who have already done essential contributions and initiatives in handling OSEC in Southeast Asia, but we know that there is still a need for enhancement. One of ECPAT's recommendations in the context of ASEAN includes prioritizing OSEC and child sexual exploitation in travel and tourism, which are both present in 3 countries included in this proposed study. UNODC also recommends strengthening regional cooperation through sharing experiences and best practices between countries with experiences in OSEC and other countries in the region whose OSEC interventions are not yet fully equipped. So for the ASEAN state and non-state actors, there are various people or groups involved in this concern in Southeast Asia and globally. So state actors would usually involve, of course, the government and its institutions seeking and implementing justice, such as the law enforcement and prosecution agencies, as well as the agencies providing care for those who are victimized by OSEC, such as the social welfare and development institutions. So enhancing the capacities of these actors would contribute to improvements and efforts in ways of combating OSEC. In a study conducted by World Vision Philippines in 2021, for example, they say that it is paramount that the agencies are well trained with capacity to implement child-friendly legislation and has enough skills to take action in investigating, referring, and solving cases based on reporting mechanisms. So ultimately, strengthening justice systems is important as a role of ASEAN government or state actors in order to keep um, to deter the perpetrators in committing OSEC and other forms of violence against children. So the non-state actors would involve these 3 points here: the tech sector, financial sector, and the civil society sector. So they are crucial and they actually play vital roles in the process of combating this crime. So for the tech sector, detection and prevention of OSEC is crucial, of course. And this needs to be addressed by different technology industries since this is where the crime is happening on various platforms. Social media platforms and internet or electronic service providers are expected to have proactive role in developing protection mechanisms within their platforms that would help detect and prevent OSEC. As for the financial sector, they are also important, of course, to track suspicious transaction reports data that are related to OSEC. Through these data typologies, links to different aspects involved in OSEC could be measured, tracked, and endorsed to law enforcement agencies for appropriate action. According to the Anti-Money Laundering Council, suspicious transaction reports that are related to OSEC mostly identify money service businesses, including money transfer agencies, as the most commonly used channel in facilitating payments for OSEC. So therefore, we need to activate financial sectors and involve them in this fight, and they should have regulatory and policies in order to play their roles in this process. So lastly, the civil society organizations, community leaders, faith-based organizations, and international or local humanitarian organizations that are working together alongside the state actors in combating OSEC in these 3 countries and within the region. So the local NGOs, international NGOs are usually in part, and even the faith-based organizations are usually partnering with the SWD in terms of providing immediate shelter, rehabilitation, recovery, and reintegration for rescued children who are victims of OSEC. So along with the community leaders within the level of the barangay, these groups are able to create child-friendly approaches and spaces for intervention and raise awareness in the communities about the impact of OSEC and, of course, reporting any cases of OSEC to the relevant and concerned authorities. So these actors in the ASEAN should continue bilateral and multilateral negotiations based on the existing regional plan of action and declaration on the protection of children from all forms of online exploitation and abuse, including OSEC. What are the gaps in the existing literature about OSEC? So first, measuring the actual prevalence of OSEC. is a crucial gap because there's no baseline statistics. So it is harder for the actors involved to combat the crimes since they don't have the baseline data of how many children are being exploited, how big and what types of interventions are needed. Second is accounting for all OSEC terminologies and context and having accurate definition of each context. So as we know, there are many different manifestations of OSEC and terminologies used among countries which contribute to the challenge in identifying the prevalence and context of the crime in the literature. So it is important to address this because it has implications on research, policy making, and other intervention strategies. So third, there is not much literature written about OSEC specifically for these three countries, especially those that are academic and evidence-based. So it is important to consider providing more academic and evidence-based studies about the crimes since it is already a known phenomenon and existing for quite a long time since the digital era. And this, so since we don't have enough studies in the Philippines, so which are academic and evidence-based, so it is also harder to provide more evidences to the as to the context and the interventions needed and what should be the policy recommendations eventually. And lastly, the need for further knowledge and studies about the landscape of legislation frameworks and interventions in OSEC. So, as mentioned earlier, and in relation to the first three gaps that have been identified, so it is important to identify legislation gaps which are concerns in the literature, both at the national and international level, in order to support strengthening of justice systems, child protection, and prevention and detection of the crime, and enhancing services provided to the child victims or survivors. So for my synthesis and recommendations, first, we have seen that OSEC is a broad phenomenon encompassing different manifestations in other Southeast Asian countries as compared to the Philippines. So for instance, in Cambodia and Thailand, OSEC is usually linked to travel and tourism industries, which in some cases facilitates hands-on sexual exploitation of children. However, in the Philippines, it is usually manifested with the presence of a trafficker, usually a family member, a parent, or a community member who negotiates production and trafficking of CSM via live streaming or other means. Second, more academics should be involved in research and program development for OSEC, as we know many interventions are being crafted and implemented to combat OSEC. So we need more academics to do research and program development for that in order for us to attain our goals and ultimately protect children from all forms of violence. Third, measure prevalence of OSEC. To date, existing literature do not capture the actual prevalence of OSEC in Southeast Asia and specific countries in the region. Still, the estimates that indicate the crime suggest that it is an alarming and spreading problem in the region. Um, Next is proactive interventions, especially among the tech and financial sectors. So, as mentioned earlier, it is important to early detect and prevent the crime before it surfaces on the internet. So, in that action, we would be able to protect more children. So, lastly, bilateral and multilateral negotiations are needed in order to ensure child protection in the region. So, we have seen that OSEC is a concern not only at the national level, but more so at the regional and global levels. Since the crime is occurring in the digital space, which does not have the concept of borders. So, here also I've added gaps and challenges in responding to sexual exploitation of children overall, not just OSEC in the ASEAN, as provided by the End Child Prostitution and Trafficking or ECPAT International and international non-government organization combating um, all forms of sexual exploitation of children in different parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. So that would be all for my presentation. If you have questions, feel free to leave them at the comment or email me. I'll um, also flash my email here on the screen. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation and be safe. Thank you.